Thank you very much, Susan. I'm Peter Cook with Bloomberg Television. Thanks to all of you for being here. Pleased to be part of this Big Ten conversation. And this is a timely topic, as we all know. The challenge, the balancing act between national security and civil liberties, how the internet plays into all that, how modern communications play into all that. And we have a great all-star panel of experts to weigh in on this topic. I'm going to go through and introduce them now, and we're also going to ask for you all to participate in this. I'll get to that in just a moment, but first of all, Professor Susan Benesch. She founded and directs the Dangerous Speech Project. She teaches human rights at American University. She's also taught at Georgetown and at Princeton on human rights and refugee law. We have, of course, the former Attorney General of the United States, Judge Alberto Gonzales, who's with us, was counsel to President Bush before he became Attorney General, also served, of course, on the Texas State Supreme Court. And Judge Gonzales, welcome. Thank you for being here. And we have the number two at the Department of Homeland Security. We have Jane Holl Lute, who is leaving the department in the next few days, but we're very pleased to have her here after a very long career, not only in government service, but also at the United Nations as well. 30 years experience. She served on the national security staffs of both President Clinton and also George H.W. Bush, served as well in the U.S. military, and again, been at leading the efforts of the Department of Homeland Security and on a whole range of topics. So great to have your expertise and analysis here as well. And I want to start again by reminding you all that we want participation from the audience, and you walked through some scenarios earlier with my colleague Trish Regan on that topic, and we're going to ask you to do the same again with the devices you have here handy. We're going to kick off this discussion by walking you through a scenario and ask you to make a decision on your own. I'm going to walk you through it, and we'll put the results up right away, and then we'll have a discussion about this scenario, try and walk through a few of these, and also encourage you later to ask questions using these same devices. I'm told if you push the button where the microphone is, it becomes a microphone, so remember that for later. There'll be a little quiz on that. But I'm going to walk you through this first scenario, get the audience to weigh in, vote right away. We'll see the results, and then I'm going to turn to our panel and get their take. You are a senior federal agent, and your team has just uncovered a plot to attack Chicago mass transit stations. You have evidence that in the next week, a group may detonate explosives using mobile phones. What do? Here are your options. 1, using legal methods, immediately shut down all mobile networks in the area until the suspects are in custody or the explosives are found and disarmed. 2, shut down the mobile networks, but only when the evidence shows a clear and imminent threat. 3, inform the mobile carriers of the situation, let them make their own decisions. 4, address the threat without shutting down the networks. It's going to take a few seconds here, and we're going to get the results up on screen here, and then I'm going to turn to our guests and get them to tell us what decision they would have made under that scenario, and again, get them to weigh in on the decisions here by the audience. So here we go. So pretty close. In fact, very close. We've got a tie here. So number 2 and number 4. I'm going to turn to someone who has to make these kinds of decisions, or at least weigh in on them in real time right now. Secretary Lute, what do you make of this?
That's fascinating.
What's the right decision here?
What's the right off the bat? I'll say 2 things. What you want to discern in very short order is what is the problem, what can be done, who should take the action. But this question really illustrates, and the audience response I think is illustrative as well, the big difference that exists between national security and what we understand to be national security and homeland security. National security, where I've spent most of my career, is strategic, centralized, top-driven, dominated by Washington. Homeland security is transactional, it's operational, it's decentralized, it's bottom-driven, it's driven from the homeland. Here, Washington is not a national actor, it's a federal actor. And power, authority, capability is shared with state and locals. The city of Chicago will have very strong opinions about what gets done. The private sector will have very strong opinions about what gets done, and so, as you might imagine, with the federal government.
Judge Gonzales?
Well, I would approach this at 2 levels. Obviously, the president is going to want to know, well, what do the operational folks believe should be the appropriate action in order to keep Americans safe. And I can't speak for President Obama. I think President Bush would have said, we're going to do everything we can legally in order to prevent this threat from harming anyone. And so then you turn to the lawyers and say what can possibly be done to protect America. And the thing is, certainly after 9/11, the emphasis for the federal government shifted from one of prosecution to one of prevention, in that the priority was to gather information, to do so in a lawful way in order to prevent another attack, to prevent any loss of life. And if it means that you jeopardize the prosecution, then you jeopardize the prosecution. Now, obviously, we're working with professionals who are very good at what they do, and so in most cases, you're able to go ahead and bring someone to justice. But the mindset is that you're going to do what you have to do to protect the loss of life. You're going to do so in a way that comports with the law.
Professor, we had 43.37% say address the threat without shutting down the networks. What does that tell you about not only this audience, but how the public right now, the American public out there, treats these kinds of national security, civil liberty issues right now?
I'm encouraged by that because it shows that many members of this audience are concerned about the danger of shutting down the networks. At least that's what I presume. It's important to worry about that because of the enormous potential negative consequences that could have. Obviously, if people can't communicate with one another, especially in a situation of public threat and anxiety, that could itself have all kinds of, as I say, of negative consequences. It's also the case that if the government shuts down the network in response to a terrorist threat, that would be a signal to other potential terrorists that they can paralyze at least the city of Chicago by presenting evidence of a threat. But in that fourth answer, address the threat without shutting down the networks, is implicit the idea that there are alternatives, that there are other ways of trying to prevent such an attack, and in fact, that's the case. Last thing I would like to point out about this is that it reminds me of a similar debate that we have had so often with respect to the use of torture. So often there's a hypothetical, for example, there's a school bus full of school children, and a government has someone in custody and suspects that person has information that could prevent the blowing up of the school bus and would save the lives of all of those children. That's a terrible hypothetical to think about, but fortunately it's usually not quite that clear. In other words, you don't have only one policy option, and you don't know that the person you've got in your clutches is the only person who has information that could prevent such an attack. So I'd just like to point out that address the threat contains within it a number of other unexplored possibilities.
Secretary Lute, Judge Gonzales mentioned, of course, 9/11, how that changed the decision-making process, this entire discussion in so many ways for Americans and for the federal government, for people in positions like yours. We've just seen what's played out in Boston. Walk me through the decision-making process right now for you and how you have to factor these things in when you're making real-time decisions. This is a hypothetical, but it certainly sounds pretty realistic.
So I stepped through a framework pretty quickly, which is we really want to understand the problem. I spent a long time in the military. One of the first lessons you learn as a young officer is that the first report is always wrong. But it is a first report. There's something going on here. We want to know more. So you immediately deploy your resources to understand what is happening. What is the problem? What do we know? What do we not know? What are the sources, and how do we validate that information? So you're moving out immediately to establish an understanding of the space that you're in. What is the threat that we are being presented with? We have operated for a very long time, for a time when it comes to something like this, a potential terrorist act. The terrorists are out there trying to come here. And so our approach has been to find them where they are, keep them out, and prevent them from carrying out their deeds. This says they might be here. So a strategy that says keep them out is sort of, from the beginning, not the right strategy. So we'll spend a lot of time intensively trying to ascertain what's right here, what is happening, and mobilizing resources, I think as Judge Gonzales said, to prevent this from happening, save lives, and ensure that the American way of life and the values in which that way of life are so deeply rooted can be preserved. So the first instinct would not be shut down the internet, shut down all the telephones until we figure out what's going on. For goodness sake, that's part of the way in which we'll find out what's going on.
Let me just say that the Secretary is right in terms of the level of coordination, cooperation, consultation within the federal government is much better today than it was on 9/11. It's also much better at the level between the federal government and state and local officials. And that in order to successfully respond to this kind of threat, the federal government is going to need tremendous assistance and help. It's going to need the eyes and the ears of folks on the ground. It's going to need the expertise of those in the industry in order to be successful in responding to this threat. And then finally, I would just say that sitting here today on a beautiful day in Washington, D.C., it's easy to vote on these kinds of scenarios because there's no life at stake with the decision you just made with these scenarios. But imagine, really, I mean, when you vote to say, well, we're not going to shut down the internet, we can't do that, we can't do this, but if a life is really at stake, it really puts a different gloss on the problem that you're confronting.
Let me follow up on that, and let's take this scenario a step further. You go to a wireless carrier and say, we need to shut this system down because we have this threat. They say no. What do you do?
Well, I'm hopeful that we don't get to that situation where you've got, say, for example, the Attorney General informing them that, in fact, this needs to happen, and the attorney and the company is responding to an order from the Attorney General. So, I'm hopeful that would not happen. Perhaps the company's going to say, go get an order from a judge, and maybe you're able to do that. I believe under the right circumstances, the carrier is going to respond in a responsible way and do that. But I think because it is an extreme measure, it is something you're not going to do right off the bat. I think it's something you're going to do when you believe you have all the information you possibly can have, and that is the only way to protect human life.
We talked a little bit, and Susan mentioned it off the top, about the internet and how it's changed things. Such an incredible tool for communication right now, for good and for those to communicate things perhaps that not everyone likes. The idea that individuals are being recruited here in the United States online through online radical ideas, websites, whatever. Secretary Lute, how big a threat is that right now, and what should the federal government, if anything, be doing about it?
So it is, it's not a crime in this country to be radical. It's not a crime in this country to be extreme. Where we all become concerned is when that radicalism and extremism translates into acts of violence, or even imminent acts of violence. And we have developed both case law and a trajectory of a legal tradition of understanding when our speech intersects dangerously with actions that could result in loss of life. Is it a problem now? Of course it's a problem. What we have is individuals, or the internet functioning for individuals very much the way families and culture. Our families, our culture, our contacts, they all inspired, nurtured, trained, and sustained us in the lives we want to lead. The internet is now available for that task. And some are turning it in ways that certainly are inimical to society's interests. But it is not the case that we have to sacrifice our civil rights and civil liberties to preserve our security. I mean, our security is really designed to preserve them to begin with. And so it's a false choice to say that, as individuals who are radical become moved to violent extremism, that we somehow have to curtail our civil rights and civil liberties in order to protect ourselves. That's not a view we hold.
A false choice, Professor Benesch?
I couldn't agree more, and the Secretary has put it very beautifully. The internet is indeed being used by extremists, by the way, by many sorts of extremists. The number of websites dedicated to hatred, to racism, to anti-Semitism, to anti-Islam ideas and so forth has increased dramatically in recent years. But we have a legal regime that has dealt relatively successfully with this kind of sentiment offline, and it should and does function relatively well also with respect to speech online. And as the Secretary said, it distinguishes between speech on the one hand and speech that either is tantamount to action. After all, there are many types of speech, such as speech to establish a criminal conspiracy, that constitute crimes and therefore are not protected by the First Amendment. And then we also have a legal mechanism for distinguishing between speech that is hateful and speech that is, on the other hand, hateful and is likely to cause imminent lawless action. That is also not protected by our law and therefore can be restricted.
I agree that you don't have to sacrifice liberty, civil liberties in a time of great danger to this country, but if you look at the history of this country and the Supreme Court decisions, it is true that the line between what's acceptable and what's not does shift. As recently as a case of the Supreme Court case involving an American citizen, Hamdi, and he was detained by the U.S. government, and the Supreme Court said, well, he cannot be detained except until you give him due process. But the court was very clear, at least the plurality of the court was very clear in saying the level of due process that's required can take into account the circumstances, the military necessity of dealing with someone in an ongoing conflict. And so the point I want to make is that throughout our history, the court has been, to some degree, to some extent, more deferential, sometimes not, but the court has been sensitive to the fact, the circumstances in connection with government actions that may impact civil liberties.
Do you think things have changed in that regard simply since you were Attorney General? The sheer number of websites out there, the threat posed to the United States, has that line moved again, the line you're talking about?
I think that there are more websites, although the Secretary would have more current information than I would have. But the truth of the matter is, there's a danger to having more websites, but it's also a benefit to the intelligence community, to law enforcement, because it does provide a trail, does provide information, and it does, it provides access to the thinking of people that may pose a danger to this country. So it's a burden, but it's also can be very helpful to the law enforcement community and the intelligence community.
Secretary Lute, can you think of a reason why the federal government, Department of Homeland Security, would tell a website right now, you need to take this down because it poses a threat to the United States?
We do that all the time when laws are violated, for example. And again, it is this area. One of our core values is freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and we're seeing freedom of assembly play out also online. Are we confronting issues of novel impression for us as a society to sort of say, what do we really think about this? To a certain extent, yes, but we've got a bedrock and a tradition and a shared sense of common purpose norms and values that I think has guided this country, and we all think has guided this country well over time. Is there problematic content on the web in the hands of people who are intent on causing danger and misery? Yes, there is. Will the government stand by and do nothing in the face of that intersection of tangible, available information to people who intend to do others harm? We're not going to stand aside. Our job is to address threats that face our society, and we're going to do it under the law.
Professor Benesch, I know this is something you've studied very carefully. Your thoughts about the appropriate role for government in the scenario I just outlined there, and what is the most effective outcome here in terms of government trying to reduce that threat to the United States?
Well, I think that's a key question. What is the most effective? That's, I guess, again, kind of hidden in the scenario, and is also an essential question when making any policy decision. Taking down a website is not necessarily going to, first of all, suppress the speech that's in it, because there are so many different places in which speech can now be posted and disseminated. And it also may not prevent the putative result of that speech. If we're thinking about speech that might lead to lawless action, to violence. So as Judge Gonzales has pointed out, often leaving speech up gives an opportunity to the intelligence community to gather information that would be a more effective route to preventing the violence that is the only basis we've really given collectively for blocking speech. So you have to ask, if you're going to block speech, what's the point? Will it be successful? In most cases I can think of, first of all, it wouldn't be lawful. And secondly, equally importantly, it wouldn't even work. So that's important to remember.
Much of the speech is coming from outside our borders, and there are limits to what we can do, and that's why, as I'm sure the Secretary can attest to, I mean, the level of cooperation with between law enforcement agencies around the world is so critical, and why developing relationships, confidence and trust, and sharing of information, law enforcement information, intelligence information, is so vitally important, particularly in connection with dealing with threats through the internet.
Can you share with us a better sense of exactly what we're talking about? A lot of us aren't looking at these websites, but for the people who are, what are they seeing? What poses the real risk to the U.S. right now as you sample what's out there?
You know, again, I'm an operator. Homeland Security is an operational department. Our job is to help build a safe, secure, resilient place where the American way of life can thrive. And every word in that sentence is important. Safe, secure, resilient, where our way of life can thrive. And our way of life values freedom, values freedom of speech, freedom of expression. We have individuals who find themselves on the internet, who inform themselves with very practical ways to do to undertake violent acts, and that's concerning. The intersection of those two factors is concerning to us. But again, being radical in this country is not a crime. It's when that radicalism turns to violence or imminent violence that government acts. And as Judge Gonzales said, you know, when we take information, what do we know, for example, about what terrorist organizations are doing overseas? How might some of those tactics, techniques, procedures, those approaches, the vulnerabilities that our knowledge of those operations reveals to us, what should we share with the 800,000 state and local law enforcement and sworn peace officers in this country? What should we share with the political and community leaders in our great cities or in other areas where we might have more specific information related to a coalescing threat? We're going to share that.
How does Boston change things?
So Boston, I think, illustrates in a very clear way two things. At first, it illustrates is that we are under risk. There are threats in this country. There are individuals who are determined to do others harm, and that is continuing. There's no complacency that we can afford, even in the wake of 9/11 and the great progress that we have made in moving further and further away from that date. The second thing that it has told us is that the engagement of the federal government with the state and local authorities over these past 10 or 12 years, under the previous administration, we've continued it under this administration, have built an ability to respond rapidly when bad things do occur, and get help to those who need it, limit the damage, and then successfully conduct a law enforcement operation, again, drawing on many officers from many jurisdictions to move this rapidly to a successful resolution.
Judge Gonzales, does it make any difference if the suspects in the Boston case learned how to make this bomb off the internet, off of instructions that they got from a website?
Does it make any difference to what we should do in response to dealing with web?
Should we treat that internet material any differently, that website any differently?
I don't know whether or not I have. Well, I know I don't have as much information as the person sitting next to me about the case, so it's hard for me to respond to that question. I mean, no one should be surprised by this. At least I certainly am not. And I think after 9/11, there have been numerous studies that have been done about the importance of the internet and radicalization. And so the question is obviously to gather as much information as we can about this particular case, so that the government can begin developing or building upon its current strategies in terms of what's the best way to deal with this radicalization, which is a very serious threat and which is facilitated over the internet. And so we don't want to shut down the internet, right? Of course not. So what is the best way to respond to the fact that radicalization, that the internet is being used and people are being radicalized, And as a result of that, people are being killed in this country.
You want to add anything to that?
I do. If the question is, should we in some way restrict use of the internet in this country because the bombers in Boston may have learned how to make a pressure cooker bomb from a website? The answer is emphatically no, because there are plenty of places, online and offline, where unfortunately someone who's determined to make a pressure cooker bomb can find out how.
You know, when we think back, in 1994, the Rwandan genocide, 800,000 people killed in 90 days. Hate radio played a key part in that. Not particularly sophisticated killing technology, but relentless. We knew before victims did that they would be victims. Now we live in an age where the internet makes more precise information available in real time, compressing our ability to decide, act, and respond, prevent. We need to rise to those challenges.
You and I were talking earlier about the Rwanda example.
In fact, we've considered and I hope resoundingly rejected the idea of restricting speech as a solution. So I'd like to turn to alternatives. It is possible, especially in cases like the Rwanda genocide, in which you have violence committed by a large number of people and condoned by an even larger number of people. In situations like that, there is an extended collective process of socialization and sensitization to violence that requires speech, that uses speech. We can track that. I have defined what I call dangerous speech as a subset of hate speech. It's inflammatory speech that has a special capacity to inspire violence. There are methods that we're now beginning to explore that bear much more investigation for counter speech. David Drummond mentioned this on the first panel earlier today. We must look into ways to make people less susceptible to inflammatory speech, to incitement, to speech designed to make them hate and fear other people. If we do that, then we have a possibility, the possibility of preventing violence on a considerable scale. If we run around and try to find every website that describes how to make a bomb, or run around and try to find every person who's feeling hatred and might one day turn into a violent radical, those options will definitely not succeed.
I'm going to change gears and go to our second scenario. Everyone ready to do a little more voting here? Make your own decisions? This is scenario 2, at least in our list here. A Chinese internet giant seeks to acquire a U.S. social media company. Their acquisition offer includes plans to open up a major R&D facility in the U.S. that will employ 2,500 Americans. Questions are raised about whether the acquisition will give the Chinese government a new way to penetrate critical networks. You are the U.S. official in charge of ruling on this acquisition. What do you do? 1, reject the acquisition. 2, allow the acquisition but require regular reports on how they're using the information they acquire. Allow the acquisition, but only if U.S. officials are allowed to monitor its activities in real time. 4, agree to the acquisition without any conditions. Let you all use your gizmos, vote away, and then I'll ask our panelists here what they think about this. So here we go. Allow the acquisition, but require regular reports on how they're using the information they acquire. I'll turn Judge Gonzales. Is that the right decision?
Well, I don't recall under CFIUS what kind of conditions the government can impose. I'm assuming, and so I'm going to defer to the Secretary about that, but to the extent that they can impose requirements, I mean, part of the CFIUS process, of course, is for the secretaries to make a recommendation to the president as to whether or not to permit an acquisition to go forward. And they satisfy themselves that the acquisition, and I can't remember now what the standard is. Let's just say, for purposes of this example, that it doesn't jeopardize or harm the national security of our country. And so they make a recommendation that we believe we can have conditions imposed upon the acquisition in a way that we're satisfied we can protect ourselves. I just don't recall enough about the process. But we do have a CFIUS process, which the Secretary can explain, where various agencies do have the ability to look at the merits of an acquisition and make a determination as to whether or not they believe it should go forward or not. And depending on the outcome of that recommendation, it goes up to the President, and then the President weighs in on it. So I don't know. I think if I could feel comfortable based upon the information given to me that this would not be harmful to U.S. interests, and if the law does allow certain conditions, I could live with that.
Secretary Lute, the Bloomberg story comes across your desk. This acquisition, this bid's being made. Are you nervous about it?
No. I hand it to Pete. He calls you back and takes care of everything. I mean, the CFIUS standard is there an unremediable threat to the national security interest of the United States? I mean, and look, this country has four real, needs at this moment in time. We need a safe and secure homeland. We need a dynamic economic engine that can generate new wealth. We need strong friends and allies. We need predictable relations with others. This is a country that participates actively, vividly, daily in the world in which it finds itself. We live. Homeland Security has daily interaction with the global movement of people and goods. We are enriched by and enrich the rest of the world through these interactions. But we also are going to be mindful and attentive to our security needs. This plays out, as you mentioned, in the CFIUS process. This is not an unreasonable reflection of the debates that sometimes occur.
What kind of conditions? Do you recall what kind of conditions an approval can be imposed upon?
Yeah, so there would be a discussion of the kinds of things that would be recommended in order for the
Regular
transaction.
reporting would be okay?
That could be something that could
that's
emerge.
What I think. Yeah.
What if I added the words to this scenario, a Chinese internet giant in part controlled by the Chinese government?
I would presume that to be the case anyway.
Yeah.
Okay.
So there's a process for that, as you might imagine.
It's a higher test, isn't it?
I'm reacting to higher. The standard is one that people take seriously. We look at these transactions and make recommendations on the basis of judgments against the standard I spoke about.
It was my experience also, and this shouldn't surprise anyone, generally in these kind of cases, it always seemed to be that agencies like Commerce and State would be in favor of moving forward with this kind of transaction, but Department of Homeland Security, Justice, maybe DOD generally would be more skittish, more skeptical about allowing such an acquisition to go forward.
Someone who covers these stories a lot, there are a lot of these we never even hear about where an offer is made and they're quietly told by the CFIUS folks, this isn't going to happen, don't even try it. This is a pretty real scenario, isn't it? Or at least the broad outlines of this is something that could confront the U.S. government.
I have a question to ask about number two, if I may. Who would be submitting these regular reports, and why would you believe them?
Good question.
These are. I'm not going to discuss any a particular civic case, certainly, but the mitigation measures would be such that they would have an integrity and credibility to them, so that they could be relied on.
You have to believe it. Yeah.
Fair enough.
This launches into another topic of discussion, hot topic right now, cybersecurity, and the threat posed right now from outside groups, from folks within the United States. Talk to me, if you can, about the President's executive order, your worries at Homeland Security about the cybersecurity threat right now.
So this is something we spend an awful lot of time on. 4 years ago, when the administration came in and we were writing the first ever quadrennial Homeland Security review, we said, look, we want to create this safe, secure, resilient place where our way of life can thrive. We need to do 5 things. We need to prevent another 9/11, prevent terrorism here. We need to secure our borders, administer and enforce our immigration laws, build national resilience, and ensure the security, the nation's cybersecurity, particularly for our critical infrastructure. So we called it out as a national level mission. But what we've learned over the course of time, that what's really interesting about cybersecurity is that unlike physical security, security is typically something that societies assign to their governments to take care of. Safe streets, governments, you run the police, you make the laws. Obviously, through an inclusive process that we have in this country. We want a safe country. Government, you run the military, you conduct the treaties. Governments own security space. But that's not necessarily true in cyber. That has not been how the internet has evolved instantaneously and organically over the past 25 years. That assignment has not been given to governments. Well, this government is not standing still. There are threats posed to this society in cyberspace, and we are taking action to play a role in ensuring that we can build the nation's finest cyber economy and that we have cybersecurity for all. And that's what you're seeing play out in the executive order.
And there's a debate up on Capitol Hill right now, Professor Benesch, about collaboration between the private sector and the government on cybersecurity, the need to share more, potentially. What do you make of that debate?
Well, I gather that the Senate has decided to write its own bill, its own separate version, and so there's much more discussion to be had.
And what about the civil liberties questions that raises?
Well, as you might imagine, I tend to weigh in on the civil liberties side of things, but I must say that in this case, it's difficult for someone outside the government to weigh in detail the threats to cybersecurity, and it is frightening.
I mean, what we can all agree is that the status quo is unacceptable. You know, the popular saying, there are two kinds of companies, those that have been hacked, those that know they have been hacked. There is thievery, crime being committed in cyberspace. It's far too difficult to protect yourself right now. It's just too difficult. We don't have machines engaged in a way for real-time threat and vulnerability identification. The biggest problem we have is unpatched existing vulnerabilities. We know certain things, and this government is going to act. And we have made very clear to Congress our desire also that Congress act so that we can discharge our responsibilities of protecting the nation's critical infrastructure, including its cyber infrastructure.
Judge Gonzales, there are Americans out there, they hear that, and they say, that sounds great, but that makes me really nervous that maybe the federal government's getting too much of my personal information, all for the sake of cybersecurity.
Well, I certainly understand that concern, but I have to applaud and commend the actions of the Obama administration in this regard. This was something that we talked about in the Bush administration, but really made little progress in this area. And part of it's because you've got, as soon as there's any kind of discussion, the possibility of any kind of legislation or restriction on, that might affect the internet in any way, people rise up in arms, and the opposition has been ferocious. And I don't know whether or not it's going to take some kind of catastrophic event in order to change minds. And oftentimes, that's what it takes in Washington, some kind of either a scandal, a catastrophic event, or tragedy. But it's going to happen, and changes have to occur. And, and it seems to me that we all need to try to find a responsible solution so that agencies like Homeland Security can protect you, but also to do so in a way that doesn't unduly restrict or interfere with the internet.
I mean, I guess I would point to sort of the operational reality here. This is not a theoretical problem. This is a real problem. People's concern about their information. In the past 10 years, more people have moved through the systems of TSA than there are on the planet. More than 7 billion people have moved through the security systems of TSA, and we have not had one privacy incident. Not one. We can protect your information in our effort to protect the traveling public. So let's talk about those 7 billion people. I mean, this is the world in which we live. This is really kind of interesting to me. 7 billion people on the planet. I can only think of five things that claim the active affiliation of 1 billion or more. Being Chinese, being Indian, being Catholic, being Muslim, and being on Facebook. Now that's really interesting. Where is your information? And only Facebook really knows everybody's birthday. So when we talk about this, we are entering into a new era of our information ownership, use, and we're thinking every day about how to operate, how to keep this country safe, secure, and resilient while protecting and preserving your rights that you have a right also to expect.
A right to expect, but in this world where Facebook is as prevalent as you talked about, has that right to privacy been modified in any way? Because everything's out there.
So I was the lead negotiator for the United States in a big data sharing agreement with the European Union on passenger name records. And it was actually a really extraordinary experience. We have a very different view of privacy than that prevails in many parts of Europe. Who owns information? Who has the right to say what you can do about it? We think we have the model that's right for us, as I said. 2 million people a day pass through TSA systems. 1 million people a day cross our borders. Protecting people's personal and private information we have demonstrated that we can do that. We have to continually adapt, however.
I want to ask you one quick question about something in the news even yesterday. Senate Judiciary Committee voted on something, bipartisan bill, unanimously cleared, that creates new standard. You need a warrant to check someone's email out, their online exchanges. It's a new standard. What do you make of that legislation and the threat that poses to law enforcement?
Well, here I'm going to confess that I was down in Dallas for the Presidential Library, so I'm not aware of what the Senate Judiciary Committee did. So I can't respond to your question. I'm sorry. But what does it do? What is it?
I was recovering from surgery.
Okay. Professor, help us out.
It's, well, it does raise the question that there's a different legal test now. Agencies, federal law enforcement agencies, get a subpoena right now to get someone's emails, but they don't necessarily need a judge's approval.
So this is an administrative subpoena?
My understanding is that you would need a warrant. You'd have to get a warrant.
So, okay, so now it would require a warrant. Well, that should make all civil libertarians happy. And hopefully...
Mike Lee from Utah and Pat Leahy co-sponsored.
That's right.
Okay. Well, I think that, in serious situations, it shouldn't present a problem for law enforcement. I suppose there could be an emergency situation where you feel like you don't have time to go out and find a judge somewhere in order to get a warrant issued by the judge. But in most cases, hopefully you can find someone, and it shouldn't present a serious issue for law enforcement. And obviously, the civil libertarians will be happy by the fact that a judge is involved. But of course, sometimes civil libertarians are unhappy with decisions made by judges who may have a different view of the Constitution and your constitutional rights than you do.
All right, on that, I want to go to our third scenario here, and then I'm going to open it up for questions. So everyone ready to vote, and then be ready with tough questions for our panelists here. Scenario 3, you are the chief of police in New York City. A group of protesters with a history of violence announces several rallies to disrupt the operations of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York in Manhattan. It's clear that the protesters will use a social networking website as their primary tool to organize the protests. What do you do? Call the social networking company and ask them to temporarily suspend posts about the protest. Seek a court order to temporarily shut down the group's social networking page. 3, take no action to restrict social media and increase your police presence.
This one.
Those are your 3 options.
This will have an overwhelming result.
I think so.
It's already getting murmurs up here from the panelists, so I look forward to the answers here. All right, 3 choices here.
Yes.
What do you do?
I mean, it is.
And you could see this being a potential, a real-life scenario, something we've probably seen in the last little bit. And the votes are?
Yeah.
A shocker, a shocker. Take no action to restrict social media, increase your police presence. 94%, what do you think?
I think I love the audience.
These are your people.
These are my people, absolutely. My only concern is that if you ran this poll with a randomized sample of the US public, of the population, that they would not get the right answer as overwhelmingly as this audience has. I guess we don't even have to explain to this lovely audience that the government's suspicion that you might commit an unlawful act is not a reason to take action against you, number 1. And number 2, obviously, answers 1 and 2 are grievously restrictive of freedom of expression, and we don't do that kind of thing. So, so I'm fine, the audience is fine. I think, I don't want to speak for my co-panelists, but as I say, I would be very interested to see what the public thinks, because there are indications that the public is less convinced of the tremendous importance of protecting freedom of expression, especially after events like 9/11 or now Boston.
You're the chief of police, Judge Gonzales, a group of protesters with a history of violence. What do you do here?
Well, I mean, obviously we could call the social networking company and ask them nicely, but I don't think that will do any good, and I don't think you can get a court order. So it seems to me what you do is you beef up the police presence. So I think that the audience is right in this particular case.
A court order is a tall order here?
I'm not sure that you're going to be able to, well, you may be able to find a sympathetic judge given the history here, but I think it's a pretty tough burden, and I'm not sure you'll be able to get a court order.
I'm a committed New Yorker. It's a commissioner, by the way. Let me take up in defense of the American public. I think you could do this survey 100 times, and 100 times you would get as close to a result as this every time.
Great.
I'm not sure I agree with that. I think they're in different parts of the country. I think attitudes are a little bit different. I think being a New Yorker, I think in the Northeast, being close to the site of 9/11, I think that the viewpoints, well, maybe that cuts the other way.
Do you think they're when you sit around the Homeland Security table to discuss these issues, would there be folks sitting at that table as you make these decisions today that might disagree with you?
Absolutely. That would certainly
You would
say,
want
why don't we
that.
go to the social media and see, and we would encourage that conversation. I mean, you know, I started out talking about the difference between national security and Homeland Security, and I said a little bit of the difference. National security, it's strategic, it's centralized, it's top-driven. You know, Homeland Security is operational, decentralized, bottom-driven. National security is a culture, you know, Washington culture, perhaps, military intelligence. Homeland Security is a law enforcement, emergency response, domestic political culture. It's a homeland culture. You know, it's not need to know, it's duty to share. It's a different culture. We engage with the public with an understanding that the government only has part of the answer, can only play part of the role and take part of the responsibility ensuring our safety, security, and resilience. New York has a program, has had for many years, called See Something, Say Something. This is a city with a grip on itself. This is a country with a grip on itself. We have rolled out See Something, Say Something in venue after venue across this country. We haven't turned ourselves into a big brother state, but we have engaged the public in a way that says, look, you know what normal looks like. And if it's not normal, say something. And so we do this in a way without curtailing our civil rights and civil liberties, particularly in any ways that we would find just deeply objectionable to our core values. This is a country that can protect itself and can honor its values at the same time.
Before I turn it over to questions, one quick follow-up to this, because it's in the news right now, and that is the idea, in light of what happened in Boston, the success of the videotapes that played such a role in the investigation. You've got New York, you've got communities in California talking about expanding, more videotaping, public places.
I'm okay with it.
Is that a good thing?
I think it is a good thing or a bad thing. Under what conditions do we want to be able to have the ability to know what's going on and ensure the safety of the public in ways that are both consistent with our laws and our values? We're going to see more of this.
I have no problem with it. I think if you're talking about videotaping in public places, where the courts have said there's no expectation of privacy or shouldn't be, as a legal matter, I have no problem with it. And I think it's effective, quite frankly.
Professor Benesch, a camera on every corner?
We have to distinguish very clearly between public places and private places, and I think in practice the distinction is not always so carefully made. If I may also, I just wanted to come back to the scenario with a practical point. We discussed a court order to shut down the group's social networking page, and Judge Gonzales discussed whether the court would grant it or not. I'd just like to ask, does anybody think that would really be effective? Right. The group's social networking page implies that there's only one page that such a group could use to organize its protest, and that's crazy. if anything, shutting down the page might create more buzz, might draw more attention to that group and allow it to organize even more effectively on Twitter or on another page. You know, we really have to bear in mind the nature of the internet and of other social media platforms. And therefore, always think about what would actually work. And the speech restrictive options very often just wouldn't work.
Want to open it up to questions here. Again, I'm told if you press the microphone on your gizmo, it'll work very, very well. I'd like you to say your name, where you're from, as you ask a question, and I hope somebody's got some good questions here. Anyone have a question? Go ahead, sir.
Ed Black with CCIA.
Okay.
You didn't have a choice up, which I think might be one that would enter into the reality of going to a judge, asking to monitor, including encrypted posts on the site, the dialogue that was going on. How would you react to all that?
Anyone want to tackle that?
You mean
Former Attorney General of the United States?
maybe probable cause about that's what some crime's about to be committed, some act of violence is about to be committed. Possibly, maybe that you can find a judge that will issue some kind of order for increased monitoring, but I'm not sure beyond.
The government has an interest in looking at that, looking at those communications. What the interchange on that site? Who's actually directing the protest?
Well, what makes it hard for me is the experience of past violence. To me, makes a difference. It might make a difference to a judge. If you have the same individuals involved, for example, you have reason to believe that they're going to gather together for purposes of not just to protest, but to commit similar acts of violence, then that would concern me. That might make a difference to a judge.
What about someone who responds on that site, says, "Great idea, I'll be at the protest"? What happens to that name, that person? What should happen?
I'm not sure anything should happen. I'm not sure anything would happen as a result of a response like that.
Any thoughts about that?
Early on in our conversation, Judge Gonzales mentioned very importantly that the view of the U.S. government and of U.S. courts on freedom of expression has swung back and forth according to what was going on in our history many times. It's easy to slide down the slippery slope of beginning to restrict speech, especially of particular groups. For example, we are, as a society, talking a lot more about measures that we might take to restrict, we say extremists. But we know that very often we're talking about Muslim extremists, even though there are many kinds of extremists in this country, including extremists with violent histories. So I would be tremendously cautious about the danger of proceeding against particular groups because they have a history of violence that can so easily be code for discriminating effectively against certain groups. And again, a history of anything, particularly ideas, but even of previous actions, doesn't necessarily predict the future.
Well, but what I would say is that I think the practicalities is that you're more likely to find a local judge who will not be as sophisticated, as learned as you about the extent of the First Amendment. And so, given the right set of circumstances, I think you might be able to get an order in the situation we're just now discussing. Now, but I think the audience needs to understand that the First Amendment, while it's not absolute, it's pretty much there. I mean, the Supreme Court is loath to restrict speech in this country, believing very firmly in the marketplace of ideas. Now, one can question what the notion being that when you allow unrestricted input of ideas, that's the best way to find the truth. I don't know why. There's no guarantee though that the truth is going to win out, but nonetheless, that is sort of the current thinking, I think, right now on the court, and that is the First Amendment is very, very important and would take some very extreme circumstances in order to permit the government to infringe upon that right. But that's at the Supreme Court. Down at the lower court level, I think you have a better shot of getting a more sympathetic judge.
I mean, one of the currents that undercut all of the scenarios is somehow these answers will lead us to a risk-free encounter. There is no such thing. There is going to be risk. And the question is not, do we accept the risk or not? Really, the question is, under what condition will what levels of risk be acceptable, given all of the things that we're trying to reconcile here? Our ability to engage in our daily lives, the commerce, the social interchange, that characterize the vibrancy of our democracy and our engagement with the world. You know, we know very well through our history and through our practical experience, again, not as a theoretical matter, but as a practical matter, that we face risk every day. And we have demonstrated that far and away an ability to manage that risk in acceptable levels. Unacceptable things happen, and we want to respond decisively and effectively when they do. But it's not like, you know, I mean, looking for silver bullets. It's like looking for dinosaurs in Manhattan. It's not that there are no dinosaurs in Manhattan, there are no dinosaurs. And so, you know, what we want to try and do is have a sensible approach to what role we assign to our government to play here, what role we accept as citizens, what responsibilities we accept, you know, and every step of our social organization between individual people and the federal government. And this country has demonstrated its ability to succeed in that endeavor.
Want to add to that?
I'd like to follow up on that and point out that there are also many different risks and dangers that we face constantly, many of which do cause harm, but some of them capture the public imagination more than others. For example, I was in Kenya when just after Boston, and just arriving in Kenya, and somebody said to me, "There's been another explosion in your country. Oh, and then there are also these poison letters arriving, you know, being sent to the president and the Senate." I thought, wow, I better stay in Kenya. It sounds like, you know, the United States is just absolutely. And then I discovered that the explosion in Texas was not apparently a terrorist attack. But how many people died? And could that have been prevented? And shouldn't we also think about that in a cold, sober way as we are thinking about Boston? So it's just to not to for one moment minimize the terribleness of Boston, but it's important to keep a calm and practical view of all the different kinds of threats that we're facing.
I mean, there is a reality to governing right now, is that certainly the population in this country has a right to expect that its government is inclusive, that it's transparent, that it's accountable. That means people want to know what's going on. There is a real demand for transparency and inclusivity. Do we know everything there is to know about a particular event, whether it's Boston or Texas in this regard? And what we know is that any piece of information, and this is kind of an interesting operational problem, is under stress almost from the moment it's discovered, that piece of information, from three distinct sources. That information serves a role in helping us develop more, a deeper understanding of what happened and why, particularly in the area of counterterrorism or a law enforcement investigation. You want to preserve that information to learn more. So it plays a role in threat development. It plays a role in threat interdiction. My goodness, we know this now. We need to take action to prevent loss of life or prevent more extensive damage or other bad things that could occur. And it also serves a role in an eventual prosecution, as Judge Gonzales mentioned earlier. It's a higher standard that information has to meet. But so reconciling those three roles that any piece of information has to play in an environment where the public has a right to expect their government is transparent, inclusive, and decisively moving in the discharge of its responsibilities is just the reality of the world in which we live in. It's certainly one we accept.
We've got time for another question or two. If anyone's got a question out there, right here.
Hi, my name is Brett Jacobson from Red Edge. All of the conversation so far has been on threats posed by technology. Can you discuss opportunities posed by technology to improve our security, especially as it might make TSA more efficient?
Good question. The flip side of this.
I'm a believer, you know, 1984, Apple. I mean, I believe, I do, I believe in technology, and we all do. And it's enabled us to be more educated, healthier, more mobile, more informed than at any point in history, not only us, but the planet. But what's happening in technology is that the very word used to mean tools that come into the grasp of humans. And now it's precisely the word we use to define things that are outside of our grasp. Oh, it's high tech. I mean, we're not leaving it to the experts, we're leaving it to the next generation because it's so complicated and moving so fast. And behind that is a social wave of where we're trying rapidly to understand what are the opportunities that are presented, what capabilities can I have now, the extraordinary advances in medicine, in education, in disease eradication. I mean, this may be the renaissance in brain science, in part because of technology, people tell me. And the law is a lagging indicator. I mean, it's reflective. It anticipates the familiar, and there's so much that we're seeing in the world right now that's unfamiliar. So we need open dialogues. We need not to be afraid of the ideas that are presented in our fortune and our misfortune, because together we're far stronger than alone.
Technology is again, the opportunities here for technology to improve our security.
Are enormous and underexplored, and we need not to be afraid of the ideas and also not to be afraid of the technology itself. So,
And I think that will change as our leaders step into positions of power from a generation that's very comfortable with technology. I'm not as comfortable as probably anyone in the audience, quite frankly, because of my generation. It's something that's been harder for me. And so I think that the government is going to, I think, become better in exploiting technology in order to serve the people better.
Is there any breakthrough technology, something out there just beyond our reach right now that would make a big difference right now? The sort of thing that everyone at Homeland Security says, boy, I really wish we had that off the shelf right now.
Yes.
But you can't tell me about it?
You know, look, I mean, I'm not a technologist, but I hang around a lot of people who are. You know, the challenges that we're dealing, the challenges that we're going to deal with, and the solutions to those challenges 1 year, even 2 years from now, have not been invented yet. That's how fast everything is moving. And the other thing that we know about technology is that it eventually always ends up in individuals' hands. And so the things that we carry around in our cell phones today, at one point in time in our lifetime, were unimaginably complex, expensive, exotic, perhaps even secret, that only the wealthiest, the strongest governments could own and control, and it's sitting in your remote on your TV today. And so that's the reality.
It's information. I mean, that's the currency that I think is so valuable today. Information, and for the government, as I said earlier, and as the Secretary said, I mean, I think in order for the government to continue to do its job, it has to match the change in technology. But that is something that hopefully we'll get better at as we have changes in leadership.
Any other questions out there? In the back. Can someone hand him a gizmo?
speaking of technology.
My name is Chris Fowler. I'm from Trilogy Interactive, and I'm curious to hear from the panel, in light of the crowd sleuthing that occurred after the bombings in Boston.
In light of the what?
Crowd smoothing.
Crowd sleuthing on sites like Reddit
sleuthing.
and others. Do you feel that these efforts by the public are harmful or helpful to law enforcement investigations?
I didn't understand the question, I'm sorry.
So the mobilization, as I understand, I want to put words in your
Reddit
mouth, of the crowdsourcing of the, you call it crowd sleuthing, I think, crowd sleuthing.
Yes.
People trying to determine who the suspects were on their own on the internet.
Well, I mean, there's a balance there. There's a sort, I mean, what you're looking for is information. And this is a wonderful source of information. It becomes problematic when it becomes interference. And when news reporting starts reporting information that is just false and raises concerns, raises alarms, perhaps forcing law enforcement to say something publicly that in fact may jeopardize the investigation. So I think it's, on balance, it's a plus, but I can see a situation where it would not be helpful, in fact might be harmful to the investigation.
One of the commentators that on TV were talking about the other day, they said it's an occupational hazard of law enforcement and government. I think it's perhaps it's not an unalloyed good. The American public is a tremendous asset to its government, and its government exists to serve that public. You know, as the judge said, is there more information? Somebody knows something. Let's share it and let's put it in the hands of law enforcement and authorities right away.
But does it trouble you when they share it online to the rest of the world?
It does not
Instead of calling the local police
does not
department?
trouble me. This is the world in which I was raised, where a free and open society is one in which we've been able to thrive, and preserving that. What happens then to correct for any excesses is that we have a judicial process, that individuals will be brought through so that justice can be served. It's not a substitute for that process at all, and it is a reality of the world in which we live.
Professor Benesch, do you have any thoughts about that?
Apparently the FBI was totally inundated by responses from the public. So first of all, that's a little bit of a capacity issue. If you ask the public for responses in a situation like that, in which the entire country is focused on one manhunt, then you're using gigantic resources, public resources and law enforcement resources to do that. So it's something you want not to do too often. I also would just point out the collective psychological problem. In other words, yeah, we're facing threats, there are risks, but the more that you make the public focus on terrorism, the more it becomes part of the sort of constant national psyche. And I would at least take that into account before deploying this crowd sleuthing alternative too often.
But look, it has always been true that a little information in the hands of the eager is a dangerous thing. Okay, that's, we know that. But what we're talking about here in this particular case and others is that when the public knows something, I mean, we should share it. If you see something, say something. We've demonstrated that we can do this in a responsible way and get the benefits of that, and I think, we'll continue to learn from all of these experiences and improve our processes.
We have just a few seconds left here. I was going to give each of you the chance to give us a final thought on, again, balancing this notion of national security and civil liberties and the tension that's there right now in light of the most recent events. Professor Benesch, any final thoughts?
Really just what I said, that we have on the one hand some kind of tangible threat or risk, but we also want to preserve the value of freedom of expression as a kind of constant part of our social climate and intellectual climate, so that people don't become so captivated by the notion of living under terrorist threat that they begin to shift their perception of this balance between civil liberties and national security. I couldn't agree more with the Secretary that we don't have to make the choice, and I hope that we have demonstrated that sufficiently with examples in the conversation.
Well, from my days in government, with the people that I worked with, I mean, our focus was what we have to do to protect our country. And under some very difficult circumstances, choices were made. But in every case, we tried to do so in a way that was consistent with the Constitution, consistent with the laws. And sometimes we got it right, sometimes we got it wrong. And that happens all the time. because these are the most difficult decisions that you have to make. What's important, the professor talked about, you know, the scenario about a bomb in a school bus and whether or not that would justify torture. It seems to me that we should all be worried about a situation where the most powerful person in the world can authorize action that he knows is clearly outside the law. The laws exist, they're very important as a check on our government, and so I think it's important for you to understand that from my experiences, and I believe it to be true for this administration, is that you do everything you can to protect this country, but you do so in a way that is consistent with the Constitution.
Madam Secretary?
So the President has made very clear, it's not a choice. You know, and in fact, I think, you know, for someone who has spent their whole career in and around public service in national security institutions and more recently in Homeland Security, these institutions, processes, and capabilities that we've developed, at their essence, their purpose, their whole reason for being is to preserve, support, uphold, and defend our civil rights, civil liberties, and our values. And we should never lose sight of that fact.
On that note, thank you to our panelists. Interesting discussion. Appreciate it. Thank you for the questions.